Withum's video series, The Alternative Route. Here with me today is Amanda McKenna, Financial Services Tax Team Leader from Withum, and Jonathan White, CEO of Portfolio BI. Amanda and Jonathan, thank you both for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Colleen.
So the private lending sector has been experiencing significant growth and transformation. In recent years, private equity firms have increasingly turned to private credit to support acquisition financing. Nearly 2/3 of private equity firms now utilize private credit for this purpose. And this trend is driven by the need for more flexible and tailored financing solutions that traditional lenders may not always provide. Today, we're going to discuss the marketplace challenges as it relates to credit funds, highlighting some of the trends and commonalities we're seeing across the board. So Jonathan, how do you see the private credit market influenced by macroeconomics, whether it be inflation, interest rates, or other pressures?
So, primarily flexibility. Really, as we see rising interest rates and inflation causes stress in the market, obviously then whatever transactions a manager's in come under scrutiny as how those companies are going to survive whatever stress that they're under. The wonderful thing about private credit is it provides that flexibility and not just structuring the original deal, but the potential restructuring. And what that also puts a lot of stress on the manager themselves is in areas like cost of capital, being able to measure risk, being able to convey risk, right? Transparency into the underlying private companies. And the investor pool that is invested in those managers tend to really focus on more deal level information versus the sort of broader fund level performance. And so there is a requirement for any manager in the private credit space to be able to address any nuanced question that they're going to get from investors, because there is going to be scrutiny, there is going to be stress about that whole concept of private credit not actually going through a complete macro cycle. But generally, the industry, right? So if you look back in early 2022, right, looking down the barrel of rising interest rates, inflations, wars in Europe, all of those things, the industry as a whole has demonstrated to be very adaptable in terms of creating alpha in that scenario.
And what opportunities do you see for AI in improving the complexity of direct lending, the availability of the information needed, and the legal document management?
So it's an interesting question. What we see is the private credit world is ripe for institutionalization. In other words, you look at their, let's say, hedge counterparts, right, which is institutionalized over a decade ago in terms of expectations of systems and security and data. I think that the private credit industry at large, broad brushstroke statement, is still in need of getting to that. So one of the areas that we see is that their approach to data, the data architecture, legacy decisions made on what systems tools that they use, managers really need to think about a way of cohesively bringing all that data together, but then really access to that data. So there's a couple of areas that we talk about is, first of all, if they have a single source of truth of the whole data set, being fund admin data, risk data, internal books and records, credit ratings data, then really democratizing across their organization, people have access to that without the technical skill set to be able to log into a platform, let's say. And that's where we're seeing a lot of interest in AI tools and being able to, in a natural language way, be able to interface with a huge data set to be able to query that. And think about probably the best use case is investor relations, right? Instead of going knocking on a door of a back office or middle office to find out what data points or receive reports and extract it, they can now query this natural language interface, leveraging large language models and whatever tools that we deploy to be able to bring back data, not just in a question and answer format, but really in a conversational format, which can return text data, graphical data, etc. I think one of the other big impacts that AI is going to have, and we're seeing already having, is the fact that direct lending particularly is not publicly available data. So when you invest in a company, right, you need to be able to translate the terms and conditions of that particular deal from a 400-page legal document, for example. So this is where, again, large language models can interpret that legal document, pull out the terms and conditions and structure it But in today's world, we all know AI is only as good as. It's only as good as maybe 80% of the problem. So how do we fill in the 20%? And that's where you need expertise in the space to be able to fill that to 100%. Anything short of 100% in this world is not sufficient for any manager.
So definitely a lot of opportunity there. I think it'll be interesting to see how that continues to evolve.
Yeah, and to comment on that, it iterates really quickly in today's environment.
Like everything, I guess. And Amanda, shifting from AI in private credit to some perspective from the tax side, what tax considerations are you advising clients on as it relates to private credit funds? And are there some key areas that fund managers should really be focused on?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Colleen. Where it really starts for me is understanding the private credit fund's business and what types of activities they're going to be investing in. And in particular, from a tax perspective, determining whether the fund is going to be considered in the business of loan origination, and then consequently determining if that's going to be deemed to be in a trade or business within the United States. So this is a common conversation I'm having with current clients and with potential clients. And I will say some of the common discussion points I'm having are really around structuring and what works best from a tax perspective based on their investor base. We all know that a Delaware partnership is common and works well if the investor base are all domestic U.S. based investors. But assuming that if the entity is considered in a trade or business and the fund is considering bringing in capital from outside of the U.S., funds will need to consider whether those investors will be subject to U.S. withholding tax on effectively connected income. So this is a major consideration I feel like I talk about all the time. And then another point is if the fund is intending to use leverage and intends to bring in tax-exempt investors, the fund will need to consider the generation of taxable income for those investors from UBTI. Also, the interest paid by each customer, interest they've created by creating a loan creates nexus to that state of residency. So a study is typically advised to determine the partnership's filing requirements in each applicable state. So depending on their investment strategy or geographical location or focus, this can generate additional tax compliance and costs of doing business that some fund managers may not be expecting. So a lot of conversation around that, and some of the options that are out there to mitigate those considerations or to block ECI or UBTI and those cumbersome state filings are the use of a blocker, whether that's a U.S. blocker or a Cayman blocker. Both are going to be subject to income tax, either U.S. income tax or U.S. income tax on the ECI at the Cayman blocker level. So the fund may consider using a leverage blocker, adding debt into that to reduce the tax liability at the blocker level. Some other options are a season and sell structure to avoid being even considered in a trade or business, and season the loans long enough that they're considered, from a third-party purchaser. Alternatively, there's the use of a BDC, which is a business development company. These are 1099 entities whose dividends are not considered ECI or UBTI. So that is one that fully blocks that type of income from passing through, but has some other particular tax rules to follow as well. So these are just some of the common things on the tax side that we're talking to clients about and helping them navigate through those situations as they come up.
A lot of nuances there with all the things that you're talking about. And I know we say private credit, but it's a very big umbrella on what specifically that could mean. So thank you for all that background and some of those suggestions. And thank you both for joining us today to discuss the private credit market, and stay tuned for our next episode of The Alternative Route.
Thank you very much.